The last 24 hours have in some respects been very consequential in terms of the outcome of the war in Ukraine. In other respects, perhaps one could argue that they just signal an admission from the Ukrainians themselves, or at least from President Zelensky, that events have been taking the course that I've been discussing in many programs on this channel for some time now, and which we've also discussed on the Duran, and which of course have been highlighted by others in other places. But anyway, briefly, President Zelensky, for the first time yesterday, appeared to admit the final failure, and the end of Ukraine's offensive. Now, he did this in a long interview that he gave with the Associated Press. He did what he always does over the course of this interview, which is that he blamed the failure of the offensive on other people. He said that we have a new phase of the war, and that is a fact. Winter as a whole is a new phase of the war. Look, we're not backing down. I'm satisfied. We're fighting with the second best army in the world. I'm satisfied. We are losing people. I'm not satisfied. We didn't get all the weapons we wanted. I can't be satisfied, but I also can't complain too much. All very confusing and all over the place, as one tends to get with Zelensky. But the gist of it was that he wasn't really expecting that the offensive would succeed, or at least can succeed any further, and that in effect it's been called off. And that was to the Associated Press. And he also told the Associated Press, AP, that he does not intend to hold any elections at all next year, either for the presidency or for the parliament. He spoke about the incredible difficulty of his job, how immensely difficult it is, but he made it absolutely clear that notwithstanding that, he has no intention of resigning or leaving the presidency, that he's going to remain in post, and that in terms of his overall policy with Russia and about the war, that there's going to be no change, that he's going to continue the war, that he's going to continue with the objectives that he has set, which are complete recovery of every millimeter of territory that Ukraine controlled following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, and that he still therefore aims for total victory. And as for the offensive, well, essentially, the blame for its failure is due to the fact that he didn't get the weapons, all the weapons that he says he was promised. We didn't get all the weapons we wanted. I can't be satisfied, but I also can't complain too much. That, notwithstanding that is, of course, precisely what he is doing, complaining, that is. So that was what he said to the Associated Press. But of course, that was not the only thing that Zelensky was reported as saying yesterday. Now, Zelensky, in addition to giving an interview to the Associated Press, he's also been on tour. He visited the Ukrainian military in the front lines, or at least not perhaps exactly on the front lines, but he went apparently to Kupiansk. I assume this was Kupiansk on the west side of the Oskol River. And he met there with General Syrsky, and then he gave a broadcast to the Ukrainian people. Zelensky very regularly makes nightly broadcasts to the Ukrainian people. And over the course of this broadcast, he basically said that Ukraine, from this point on, it's going to go over to the defensive, that it can't continue the offensive. Well, he didn't exactly say that, but he basically spoke about Ukraine going on to the defensive. He spoke about how he had met with various military chiefs. We'll come to that shortly. And that there was a long discussion with those military chiefs, an agreement about building fortified lines in order to repel the Russians. Again, he didn't quite say that either, but what would be the purpose or point of building up fortified lines if it was not to defend Ukraine against the Russians? So, in effect, signalling that the offensive is over, both to the Associated Press and to the Ukrainian people, whilst at the same time talking about Ukraine going on the defensive, building fortified lines, defending itself from Russian offensive attacks. And having said that, Zelensky also basically told us where those fortified lines are going to be. And it was, again, obvious that he is not prepared to retreat from a millimeter of Ukrainian territory, because he spoke about Avdiivka and about Marinka and about other places, Kupiansk, which Ukraine is struggling to defend at the moment, where the situation is getting worse for Ukraine by the hour. We'll come to discussions about that later in the program. But anyway, he talked about all of these places, and he wants, apparently, the new fortified lines to be created to defend Ukrainian positions, even in these places where ongoing battles are taking place. And then he had a meeting also with Ukrainian students. I believe this happened in Kiev, in which again he reiterated that Ukraine is going to retake Crimea. He said that the people of Crimea are expecting the Ukrainians to come, and he did admit that regaining control of Donbass would supposedly be more difficult than regaining Crimea, or at least that was the impression he sought to give. So what are we to make of all of these somewhat incoherent and complex comments that Zelensky made over the course of the last 24 hours? Well, the first is that, as I said at the outset, he is in effect admitting that the great offensive of the summer is now well and truly over. He's blaming the West to a great extent for its failure. He says that they didn't provide Ukraine with all the military equipment that it needed to make that offensive a success. But anyway, he's admitting that the offensive has not succeeded, and he is telling everybody now that Ukraine is going to go on the defensive. He's not happy about admitting that the offensive has failed. He's not really admitting that Ukraine is now on the defensive. But it's not difficult to understand that that is the meaning of his words. He's setting, of course, as I said, impossible terms for that defense. He wants Avdiivka and Kupiansk and all of these other places which are already being fought over, defended, and included in these great fortified lines that he wants to see created. He doesn't really discuss how these fortifications are to be created over the next few weeks or months, but anyway, that is clearly what he wants to see happen, or so he implies. And he wants Avdiivka and Kupiansk and all of those places defended still. But anyway, he accepts that Ukraine is now on the defensive, even though he again refuses to surrender a millimeter of ground. And of course, he is addressing Ukrainian students. He's telling them about the fact that there is going to be ultimate victory and that Ukraine will regain control of all its territories, Crimea and Donbass, and the fact that he's saying these things to this particular audience is again a further clear indication that next week we're going to get an announcement that there's going to be a general mobilization and that Ukrainian students are amongst those who are going to be conscripted to join the Ukrainian military. Now, there is something else apart from these things which I found actually extremely interesting, and that is I come back to that discussion that Zelensky spoke about when he spoke about the meeting that he had with the various military commanders. Now, he seems to have met General Syrskyi, the ground forces commander, whilst he was in Kupiansk. It's not clear to me where exactly he had this meeting with the other military commanders that he mentioned, but I noticed that he gave a list of military commanders. The most senior one that I could see mentioned was General Tarnavsky. I didn't see General Zaluzhny's name included, and I think that is correct, in which case it looks as if General Zaluzhny was excluded from this discussion. Now, just as Zelensky went off to Kupiansk to meet the soldiers there, and that visit does seem to have been covered by Ukrainian media, and apparently there are pictures and film of Zelensky's visit to Kupiansk. There are reports that General Zaluzhny himself was also visiting the front lines, only he went apparently to Kherson region and met with soldiers there. But unlike Zelensky's visit to Kupiansk, I haven't seen or heard of a single picture or image of Zaluzhny's visit to Kherson region and to his meeting with the soldiers, even though this seems to have happened essentially at the same time as Zelensky's visit to meet the military in Kupiansk. So it seems to me that we have this takeaway from all of this. Firstly, Ukraine is now on the defensive. Secondly, the offensive has failed. Third, there's going to be a general mobilization. That seems to me to be the clear gist of Zelensky's words. Fourth, there are not going to be any negotiations whatsoever with the Russians. Fifth, there's not going to be any elections in Ukraine next year. Zelensky says the Ukrainian people don't want elections. He has no intention, clearly, of holding them. And he's going to remain in office, or so he intends, throughout the whole of next year and beyond. And sixth and last, General Zaluzhny is definitely on his way out. He's no longer being included, as far as I can see, in top discussions. He's going to be made the scapegoat for the failure of the offensive, the military planning behind the offensive. He's going to be sacked at some point over the next few weeks, and it'll be presumably either General Tarnavsky or presumably General Syrskyi who will be taking over from him. And General Zaluzhny is permitted to go and meet with the soldiers in Kherson region, but the media machine in Kiev essentially ignores that visit and fails to report on it. So, in some respects, a very consequential set of moves by Zelensky, the closest to an admission that the offensive has failed that we're ever likely to get from him, the closest to an admission that Ukraine is on the defensive that we are ever going to get from him, clear signs that there's going to be a mobilization, and that Zaluzhny is going to be sacked, and that politically Zelensky is digging in, that he's going to remain president, and that there are not going to be negotiations with the Russians. But of course, and in reality, this is no different from what we have already known before. We've long known that Zelensky and Zaluzhny are on bad terms, that Zaluzhny has been sniping at Zelensky and Zelensky has been sniping at Zaluzhny, and that Zelensky wants Zaluzhny sacked. And it seems as if Zelensky has finally reached that point where he is preparing to take that step, and I suspect that it's now going to be announced fairly soon. So much has happened in terms of announcements and declarations, but it was all clearly signposted before. And of course, if you've been following the news closely from Ukraine, if you've been watching programs like this one and our programs on the Duran, or Brian Balletic's programs at the New Atlas, or other programs in other places, and following things that people like Scott Ritter and Douglas McGregor and lots of others have been saying, well, you would know. You would know all of this already. And of course, if you go even deeper in the weeds, if you go to places like Slavyangrad and the various telegram channels, Russian and Ukrainian residents and Legitimi and Strana and all those places, well, as I said, none of this would surprise you. It was clearly all heading in that direction. But note again that there is no real plan or idea here about how to bring the war to an end or to win the war. Zelensky is not offering any plan for victory. He wants Ukraine to go on the defensive, so he says. He wants to create fortified lines in imitation of what the Russians did at the end and start of this year, at the end of last year and the start of this year. There's no real plan about how to do that either. And of course, he has no political strategy to speak of other than his own survival as president. His entire plan can be simply summed up as this: hold on, hold tight and hold on, and keep your fingers crossed and hope that something will turn up. That's it. That's all that he has to offer the Ukrainian people, even as he calls on them to engage in further sacrifices, to prepare for further mobilizations, and further difficult, in fact, impossible battles which are to come. Now, coming back to that offensive, the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, has had more to say about it. And there's been yet another meeting of the Defense Ministry Board in Moscow. And again, Shoigu addressed it and has started it with certain words about the general situation in the war, the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm reading now from the Russian Defense Ministry's official translation of his words. And this is what Shoigu said. I would like to start with the situation in the special military operation zone. The total mobilization in Ukraine, those words, total mobilization, have been highlighted. So the Russians appear to think that the mobilization that is coming, that Zelensky is about to announce, that mobilization has to a great extent already been underway. But anyway, Shoigu goes on to say the total mobilization in Ukraine, the supply of Western weapons and the use of strategic reserves by the Ukrainian command did not change the situation on the battlefield. Such desperate actions of the enemy result in great losses of Ukrainian troops. For 6 months of the so-called counteroffensive, the enemy has lost more than 125,000 people and 16,000 units of various equipment. The Russian troops continue to inflict effective and powerful fire damage on the enemy. As a result, Ukrainian combat capabilities are significantly reduced. Russian servicemen act competently and decisively, occupy more advantageous positions, expand control zones in all directions. Over the past month, units of the 810th Marine Brigade, the 150th Motorized Rifle Division, as well as the 4th, 15th, 114th and 123rd Motorized Rifle Brigades distinguished themselves in the course of hostilities. Russian servicemen will continue to conduct active defense, build up the combat potential of the armed forces, taking into account the experience of the special military operation. So, again, note a few of the things that Shoigu says here. First of all, he has now increased what he says is the level of combat losses that the Ukrainians have suffered. To the best of my recollection, when he last addressed a Defence Ministry Board meeting a few weeks ago, not very long ago in fact, he put Ukrainian losses at that time at, to my recollection, 90,000 men. It's important to stress, again, that Shoigu is clearly talking about both men, dead, and severely wounded. And he's now increased that to 125,000 men, dead and wounded. 125,000 dead and wounded since the counteroffensive, the Ukrainian counteroffensive, began on the 4th of June. Now, there's much discussion about the total size of the Ukrainian army on the battlefronts. Most reports which I have seen guesstimate it at around 300,000 men at any particular time. If 125,000 men have been killed or wounded over the course of the last 6 months, then that is roughly a third of the active personnel at any one point of the Ukrainian military. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that the Ukrainian military has been reduced in size by 30% or more than 30%. There have obviously been replacements. There have obviously been people who've been brought back into the military or have been conscripted to join the military. But it's clear that the Ukrainians are suffering manpower shortages. I've discussed this in numerous programs. And if Shoigu's figures are true, and they do seem to be pretty much in line with most estimates of Ukrainian losses over the course of the offensive. Well, if Shoigu's estimates of Ukrainian losses are true, then you begin to understand the scale of the disaster that the Ukrainians have suffered over the course of the last 6 months. The scale of the losses they have suffered and the reason why their forces are now undermanned and physically and mentally exhausted as well. Ukraine cannot replace all of these losses, which is why a further mobilization is now being planned, and the survivors in the Ukrainian brigades are being asked to do more and more all the time because so many others are now wounded or dead. So this has been, I've said this before, this offensive has been a major strategic victory for the Russians, and the sooner this is understood and accepted and discussed in Ukraine and in the West as well as in Russia, the better it will be in terms of making any future decisions going forward. Not just a major strategic victory for the Russians, but a massive strategic defeat for Ukraine and for its Western sponsors as well. But going back to Shoigu and what Shoigu said, it goes even further than this. He says that Ukraine's attempts to conduct a total mobilization and the supply of Western weapons have not changed the situation on the battlefronts. Ukraine has suffered these huge losses and has made no significant gains. And Shoigu specifically says that Ukraine has been burning up its strategic reserves. The using of strategic reserves by the Ukrainian command did not change the situation on the battlefronts. And again, both I and various others have been making this point. You can see how the Ukrainian military has been forced to pull battered units from the front line, from parts of the front line, to plug holes in other parts of the front line, in places like Avdiivka, thinning the defences in all sorts of places like Bakhmut, for example, and the Vremivka salient, and Zaporozhye. And this is because Ukraine is now disastrously short of reserves, strategic reserves, because they've been used up over the course of the last few months. But there is something else which is very interesting about what Shoigu is saying, because he gives the impression that the Russians are going to remain on the defensive. He says Russian servicemen will continue to conduct active defense. By active defense, he does acknowledge that they will conduct important local offensives. They occupy more advantageous positions, expand control zones in all directions. But he's made it absolutely clear that the Russians, for the moment at least, are not undertaking a general offensive. They are taking advantage of the growing weaknesses in Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian defensives, because of the enormous manpower losses that the Ukrainians have suffered, about the fact that they have the Ukrainians have burnt through their reserves, but so far it is only an active defense. So the advances in Kupiansk, in Bakhmut, in the Vremivka salient, even one suspects the advances in Avdiivka itself, they're not part of a general offensive. They are part of the plan to occupy more advantageous positions and expand control zones in all directions. And Shoigu goes on to say, give the hint at what is coming. He says that the Russian servicemen will continue to conduct active defense, but at the same time they will build up the combat potential of the armed forces. I've discussed many times in many programs the enormous build-up that the Russians are undertaking, and here we see Shoigu briefly alluding to it, and Shoigu goes on to say that they will do this taking into account the experience of the special military operation, that they've learned an awful lot about the way in which this war is being waged, that they're improving their forces all the time, even as they're increasing in scale. And that all does, to my mind, clearly point to an eventual intention by the Russians to move on to a proper full-scale offensive when they're ready, when their forces are fully built up, and when the Ukrainians are exhausted even further. So, fascinating contrast in commentaries by Zelensky and Shoigu. Zelensky, rambling, incoherent comments, not always easy to decipher in their specificity, but nonetheless, if you are aware of the situation and you follow the politics and the military realities on the battlefronts closely, you can understand what he is essentially saying. And Shoigu, providing all kinds of facts and figures and giving us an actual insight into Russian strategy. The Russian strategy continues to be, first and foremost, what it has been throughout the war up to this point, grinding the Ukrainians down. Now, there's all sorts of further bits and pieces of news that we're hearing about things that the Russians might be planning to do. There's been more talk about the enormous increase in Russian drone production. All kinds of new drones are being prepared and built in Russia in vast quantities, and the Russians are developing their electronic warfare systems. But I noticed one particular piece of news that I saw somewhere referenced yesterday, which is that the Russians now are going to recreate the heavy artillery brigades that were once a feature of the Soviet military. Now, these heavy artillery brigades were basically closed down. They were shut down after the Soviet Union collapsed. But the plan now is to recreate them, and they will be based around the heaviest tube artillery that the Russians have. These are the 203 millimeter self-propelled guns and the 240 millimeter tulpan mortars, these massively powerful mortars that have no analogue in any Western military. And I suspect also that quite plausibly in these brigades we will also see the super powerful multiple rocket launch systems as well, including perhaps the flamethrower systems, which are now increasingly appearing on the battlefronts also. And of course the point about heavy artillery like that is that bringing it all together in a brigade and concentrating it gives you an enormous punch if you are wanting to break through heavy fortifications, which is what the Soviets used their heavy artillery for during the Second World War. And it does look as if the Russians are preparing, therefore, to deal with Ukrainian fortified lines, wherever these are. And the Russians, of course, also are now busy developing all sorts of big precision-guided bombs, which their Air Force is now carrying, 500-kilo bombs, 1,500-kilo bombs. I've heard that on occasion, 3,000-kilo bombs, massive bombs, have been deployed as well. And I can remember how back in the summer, Shoigu visited a bomb production factory somewhere in Russia, and in the background you could see pictures of the truly monstrous 9,000-kilo bombs that the Soviet military developed in the 1950s. And it seems that these have been put back into production as well. Those presumably would have to be carried by big medium bombers like the Tupolev 22M3, and in order to use these effectively, the Ukrainian air defenses would have to be further degraded. I can't imagine bombs on this scale operating on a precision-guided basis, but then, of course, I might be wrong about that. But anyway, these bombs would be enormous bombs, and, of course, if they were dropped on Ukrainian fortifications, the effect of one of these bombs dropping on these fortifications would be devastating. Now, in saying all of this, I want to say again that I'm far from convinced that Ukraine has the resources or the time to create all these fortifications that Zelensky is talking about. And, of course, it may not have the human resources to make up the numbers in its brigades either. But I suppose the thinking is that if you call up hundreds of thousands of, well, in some cases teenage boys, late teenage boys, and women, but intend to remain on the defensive, then you don't need the same degree of training that you need if your troops are going to go onto the offensive. And perhaps it makes more sense, therefore, to carry out this kind of mass mobilization that Zelensky and his Western sponsors are talking about. Anyway, we shall see what happens, but I expect that there will be that announcement of a mobilization in the next week or so. But it's clear that whatever it is that the Ukrainians do over the next few weeks and months, it will be patched together and improvised, and it probably will not be, well, in fact, it definitely will not be comparable to the enormous mobilization that is taking place in Russia. Anyway, Ukrainian commentators have now acknowledged, apparently, the gist of Zelensky's words. Apparently, even members of the Rada are now admitting that Ukraine is going to be on the defensive from this point. There doesn't seem to be any real prospect of an offensive being launched at any time in the future. One suspects that the hope is that some kind of a stalemate will emerge. I have to say, I think it is extremely unlikely. George Beebe and Jim Webb, back in August, did suggest that Ukraine go on the defensive, but they also suggested that Ukraine use any time that going on the defensive brought to start serious negotiations with Russia. And of course, Zelensky, in his various statements over the course of the last 24 or so hours, has emphatically rejected any thought of that. So it looks to me as if Ukraine, having been severely defeated this year, has now been forced onto the defensive. It will soon have a new commander, because I can't believe that Zaluzhny's days as commander in Ukrainian overall commander are anything other than numbered now. There is also a possibility of a deepening political crisis in Kiev. But regardless of all of that, given the scale of the Russian build-up that is taking place, given the manpower and equipment shortages that Ukraine is facing, given the West's inability to supply Ukraine with all the kind of weapons that the Ukrainians are urgently seeking, can't provide Ukraine with sufficient shells or tanks or such things, it seems to me that Ukraine is going onto the strategic defense far too late in the war, and as I said earlier in the program, with no strategy, no political or military strategy, either about how it is going to win or about how it is going to bring the war to an end. Anyway, let's now touch on what is actually happening on the battlefronts. Now, yesterday I mentioned that there were reports that the Russians had entered Bogdanovka, the next village beyond Khromovo in the Bakhmut area. There were lots of reports about that yesterday. I understand there's been more reports this morning. It does look as if Bogdanovka is indeed now in the process of being captured by the Russians. They're always, one has to say that you get these reports and then a few hours later it turns out that they're premature. We'll have to wait and see. But in Avdiivka, in the Avdiivka area, I think information now is a lot more clear. It looks as if the Ukrainians have finally decided that they cannot defend this village of Stepovoye to the northwest of Avdiivka, west of the railway tracks. There have apparently been films of Ukrainian soldiers fleeing this village and escaping towards Berdichi, the next village to the west. It's been suggested that it is in Berdichi that the Ukrainians now intend to make their stand, and that rather suggests that Stepovoye is about to fall, or perhaps has already fallen fully under Russian control. We will have to wait and see. Now, to repeat again, Ukrainian soldiers who are actually there, one of them specifically who spoke about the situation with El País, Spanish newspaper, about 10 days ago, Ukrainian soldiers have admitted that if the Russians are able to cross the railway, occupy Stepovoye, send their armor beyond the railway, then communications to Avdiivka are imperiled and the defense of Avdiivka becomes unsustainable and is likely to collapse. So we seem to be very close to that situation now. And there have been also numerous reports of Russian advances elsewhere in Avdiivka. both from the south and also into the industrial zone to the north, this complex web of factories and industrial buildings which adjoin the slag heap which the Russians were able to capture some weeks ago. So it looks as if the situation in Avdiivka is now deteriorating, at least from a Ukrainian point of view, fast. Now, there have been lots of other reports from other areas on the battlefronts. It's not always easy to tell what is true. There was another report I saw this morning that the Russians have finally captured all of Marinka, for example. There have been so many reports at so many different times that the Russians have done this that I'm going to treat that with great skepticism. But it does seem as if over the last few weeks, the Russians have been increasing their pressure in Marinka, and that the Ukrainian defenses in Marinka have been gradually crumbling. The last report I saw, last reliable report, or semi-reliable report I saw about a week ago, was that the distance that the Russians still had to cover in order to clear Marinka entirely was down to 700 meters, less than a kilometer, in other words. And perhaps, just possibly, conceivably, they might have managed that over the last couple of days. No doubt we will be getting more information about this soon. But anyway, overall, situation on the battlefronts, the trend of events on the battlefronts remains the same. The Russians still focused on grinding the Ukrainians down. That is what Shoigu told us in this meeting with the Defense Ministry Board that I've discussed. The Russians will continue to conduct active defense. They continue to shape the battlefield to their advantage by advancing where they can. They occupy, again, these are Shoigu's words, more advantageous positions and expand control zones in all directions. The Russians continue with this massive build-up that they're still engaged in, the huge mobilization, the huge call-up of professional soldiers that I've talked about, the enormous increase in military production, the reorganization and retraining of their forces, the modernization of their forces. And in the meantime, Ukraine, without a clear strategy about how to win the war, but with a political leadership that cannot acknowledge, that is unable to acknowledge or accept that the war is lost, now talking about going on to a defense, but with perhaps lacking the tools even to do that. Anyway, that's where we are in the conflict in Ukraine. Now, there's been a certain amount of other news that's been percolating as well. Jeffrey Pyatt, formerly the US ambassador to Kiev, where he played an instrumental role in the events, the Maidan events, the seizure of power in February 2014. He was also subsequently, by the way, ambassador to Greece, where he's widely suspected of having played a role in at least getting the Greek government to agree to support the decisions of the Patriarch of Constantinople, to support a breakaway Ukrainian church in Ukraine. Anyway, he's now a head of energy policy, apparently, in the Biden administration, and he's made comments to the effect that the United States is planning to reduce Russian energy revenues by half by 2030. Didn't, so far as I could see, really explain how that would be possible. But anyway, that is what he said. Now, of course, Russian energy revenues are not under US control. Russia has just played a significant role in OPEC Plus, in an agreement that Saudi Arabia and Russia have agreed together with the other OPEC states for another 1 million barrel a day production cut, which I understand is going to take effect pretty much immediately. So the Russians remain a huge player in the energy game. And of course, Jeffrey Pyatt talking in this way, seems to me it's the sort of brave statement that US officials are making in order to pretend to themselves that their sanctions war is succeeding, even as we see cumulative evidence about the way in which it has failed. We've had admissions recently from the Financial Times that practically no Russian oil any longer sells below the $60 a barrel price cap that the G7 states sought to impose at the start of this year. We see that the Russians are steadily increasing exports of oil and, by the way, gas to China and India. Very difficult to see how Pyatt's comments really have any connection any longer to reality. But they are indicative of the anger and the frustration of people in the administration, in the US government, especially people like Pyatt, who are massively invested in the whole Ukraine project, at the extent to which their sanctions bazooka, the one that they unveiled in February and March 2022, has failed. Just to reiterate again, it looks as if Russia will achieve overall GDP growth of around 3% this year. There's some signs now that the interest rate increases that the central bank in Russia has undertaken, that they're starting to slow the growth of the Russian economy, as they are, by the way, designed to do. But overall, the situation in the economy remains strong and robust, despite clear signs of overheating. And as the Russian Prime Minister Mishustin pointed out anyway, the domestic revenues from the expansion, the domestic expansion of the Russian economy are making up for the fall, such fall as did take place in energy revenues over the course of this year, as Russian exports of oil and gas were redirected to India and China. I'm going to make a guess, by the way, that to the extent that Jeffrey Pyatt really does have any long-term expectation that Russian energy revenues will decline, I suspect he expects that to happen because of this long-standing belief that many people in the West have, and which already was there in 2014 when the first big set of sanctions against Russia were unveiled, that what is going to cause Russian energy revenues to decline is that without access to Western technology, production of oil and gas in Russia is going to fall. Now, when the West imposed sanctions in 2014, they actually targeted technology for the Russian energy sector. And of course, the latest set of sanctions, the ones that were announced in 2022, expanded on those sanctions. The problem is that the sanctions in 2014 didn't work. The Russians were able to substitute for Western technology to a much greater extent than the West anticipated in terms of their oil and gas industry. And I see no reason to think that things are going to change there. If we look at the question of technology sanctions overall, there's an article today in the Financial Times about how it happened that China was able to develop its advanced chip for the new Huawei smartphone, despite US sanctions and restrictions of technology to China to develop advanced chips. And there's an awful lot of speculation and guessing about how the Chinese did it, but no real idea, because as the Financial Times concedes, the Chinese have managed to keep their success there secret. There's suggestions that the Chinese have been able to manage to do it by adapting older technologies to produce their super chip. But that's ultimately no more than a guess. And it does really surprise me that there doesn't seem to be an acknowledgement in the Financial Times that eventually, even if they haven't done so already, the Chinese are certain to be able to replicate the Dutch technology, the extreme ultraviolet technology that the Dutch use, that have developed, the lithograph machines that the Dutch have developed to produce super chips of their own, even if they haven't done so already. The United States, the Western powers, repeatedly make this mistake. They always think that they have this enormous technological advantage over their adversaries. They always assume that if they impose sanctions to restrict technology to their adversaries, their adversaries will be unable to replicate that technology themselves. It has been repeatedly proved to be wrong, going all the way back to Soviet success in the 1940s in developing nuclear weapons. Whenever the adversaries do that, it's always assumed that they've only managed to do that because of their success in stealing technology from the West, spies and that kind of thing. There is sometimes some truth to that, but there is a general inability to acknowledge the underlying truth that countries like China, and by the way also Russia, have enormous science, engineering and technology bases of their own, comparable in nearly all respects to what you will find in the West. And that a machine or a technology developed in the West can always be replicated somewhere else. But anyway, that's, I suspect, where Jeffrey Pyatt gets his ideas. I'm going to guess anyway that over the next decade or so, we're going to see energy revenues form an ever diminishing proportion of the Russian budget. This has already been true, by the way, for quite a long time. I think that Jeffrey Pyatt, like many Americans, still inhabits the idea, the universe, the where people still think of Russia as the gas station masquerading as a country. They find it impossible to acknowledge that the Russians have a diversified economy and diversified revenue streams. And regardless, if Jeffrey Pyatt really does believe that it's lack of technology that will force the Russians to lose energy revenues, I think he's going to be disappointed in that too. Incidentally, if it's electric cars, that it is the electric technologies, lithium ion and all of that, which Jeffrey Pyatt also stakes his expectations on, that fossil fuels and all of that are going to be eroded as well. Well, of course, the leaders in electric car technology are the Chinese, and the Russians are now busy developing electric car production of their own, and will no doubt be importing electric cars increasingly from China anyway. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. It's astonishing how, despite the failure of the sanctions last year and this year, some people in the United States still cling to the hope that the sanctions will eventually succeed. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about this. Yesterday, after what seems to have been another less than satisfactory encounter between Secretary of State Blinken and Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel, the Israelis resumed their bombing campaign in Gaza. They're talking about continuing their military operation in Gaza, at least until the beginning of the early part of 2024. I suspect that all that is going to do is mobilize more opposition and criticism, not just of Israel, but of the United States specifically, and of the Biden administration in particular in the Arab and Muslim world, and of course, to some extent, in the United States also. And I noticed that a former Israeli official has now written a piece in The Guardian. This is Alon Pinkas, who was Israel's consul general in New York. Remember, New York, of course, until recently, well, I believe it still is, in fact, the city with the biggest Jewish population in the world, a key place. In other words, the Israeli consul general in New York is a key figure in Israel's diplomatic cadre. Anyway, Alon Pinkas says that Netanyahu is stuck as he battles Hamas. He can't afford to lose, can't find a way to win. And the article then goes over many of the same points that I have made before, that defeating Hamas militarily is not enough. He says that he talks about Netanyahu's personal shortcomings notwithstanding, much of the twin pressures Netanyahu is under come from a fundamental gap in how Israel and Hamas define or win the asymmetrical power relations between Israel, a formidable military power, and Hamas, a non-state terror organization, are evident, For Hamas, a win can be declared if they stand on their feet and wave a single flag. For Israel, only a decisive military triumph that degrades Hamas militarily and renders it politically incapacitated will be enough. Netanyahu is well aware of that, which makes the balancing the pressure from home and from the United States, and by the way, the rest of the world, an intractable task. In other words, Netanyahu, in this war in Gaza, is setting himself and Israel an impossible goal. He's trying to achieve a political objective which is unattainable through military means, which ultimately are politically damaging for the United States and, of course, for Israel too. Anyway, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also check out our shop, buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our hoods, our t-shirts, all of the great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Lastly, just to quickly say, if you're interested in my thoughts about the late Henry Kissinger, Alex Christoforo and I have done a program about him on the Duran, and you will find it all there. I expect that program to come up very soon, if it has not already come out by the time this program appears. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.